Till the Storm Passes By, number 29 in your supplement. Sing the first and third verses and we'll be dismissed to class. Till the Storm Passes By. In the dark of the midnight, have I all in my face, while the storm comes upon me, and there's no hiding place. In the crash of the thunder, precious Lord, hear my cry, keep me safe till the storm passes by. Till the storm passes over, till the thunder sounds no more, till the clouds roll forever from the sky. Hold me fast, let me stand in the hollow of thy hand. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. When the long night has ended and the storms come no more, let me stand in thy presence on that bright, peaceful shore, in that land where the tempest never comes. Lord, may I dwell with thee when the storm passes by. Till the storm passes over, till the thunder sounds no more, till the clouds roll forever from the sky. Hold me fast, let me stand in the hollow of thy hand. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. Now dismissed for class.
I'd like to welcome everyone this morning. We have a lot of visitors, and I'm going to go ahead and apologize that Bruce is not here. I'm filling in, and I asked several people to do this, and everybody turned me down, so y'all are stuck with me. When we do one-ups like this, it's easy for me, I'll admit, to do characters. Hopefully that's something you can take with you and remember. Today we're doing two characters and really a theme, so we're going to talk about Uzzah and Uzziah. So if you get those confused like me, sometimes remember Uzzah is the king, has the I in it with the king, helps me remember, if that makes sense. So we're going to talk about both of those and then make some applications, hopefully. The college class, I was supposed to teach that, and we're doing that out here. We'll do Ecclesiastes 7, I think, next Sunday. So, all right. So most of us probably know Uzzah. Maybe most of us know Uzziah. Took me a little bit to remember about him. I think Todd was teaching Bible authority, and this came up, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember that story. And so that's kind of where I went with that. So what do Uzzah and Uzziah have in common? Can anybody tell me before we start reading the scripture, besides their names being very similar? Anybody remember? What happened to Uzzah? Y'all should remember that.
Set in the ark? Didn't he set in the ark right away when the oxen stumbled?
Yes, and what happened?
He was struck down for it.
Okay. What happened to Uzzah? Does anybody remember? Todd? I hope you remember.
It's been a long time.
He did not die. Well, eventually he died. Right, he was struck with leprosy. So they were both struck by God directly for their sin. So that's kind of going to be the theme. Hopefully, I'll get these together and we'll go from there. So I'm going to ask a pretty broad question, probably going to get a ton of answers on this. But why do we sin? Why does anyone sin? And I'm going to simplify this, but you can give me any answers you want. I'm going to simplify it down to two things. But why do we sin? Okay, I mean, sin is, there's pleasure in it, right? Or it wouldn't be a temptation. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably number one. Selfishness, which goes along with that. Unbelief, okay. No consequences, or you don't believe in God, so. What? Okay, thank you. That's where I was going. So in this lesson, I would assume Uzzah did it out of ignorance. We'll get into that discussion. Should have known better, but ignorance. So anything else? I mean, those are. And again, I was going to simplify it. Ignorance. You do it out of ignorance because you don't know. And the other one is basically selflessness. And there's a lot in there. Maybe peer pressure. A lot of reasons why you sin, but it still comes down to you don't put God first. So I know that's probably an oversimplification of sin, but that's kind of what I wanted to, the theme on that when we go through these two men. So it's who is responsible for our, I guess, spiritual education? Okay, ultimately we are. Who else has a role in that responsibility? Parents, definitely. Okay, in the church. I think that's where we get the knowledge of God. Other Christians, which would fall into with church, I think. So, let's turn over to, I think I will start with Uzziah. 2 Chronicles chapter 26. I want to read I guess we'll just read through 21. So let's just split that up. Andrew, would you read 5? Todd, would you read 5? The next 5. 2 Chronicles 26 chapter. So 1 through 5, and then the next 5. Garrett, would you get the next 5? I think that's through 15. And then Eli, would you finish out? Okay. Andrew, whenever you're ready. 2 Chronicles, the 26th chapter.
And all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 60 years old, and made him king instead of his father Amaziah. He built Bethel and restored it to Judah after the kings slept with his fathers. Uzziah was 60 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was of Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord according to
when he became strong, his heart was so proud that he acted corruptly, and he was unfaithful to Yahweh his God. As he entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense, then Azariah the priest entered after him, and with him 80 priests of Yahweh, men of valor. And they stood against Uzziah and the king and said to him, It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to Yahweh, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are set apart as holy to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful, and you will have no honor from Yahweh God. But Uzziah, with a censer in his hand for burning incense, was enraged. And while he was enraged with the priests, the leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priests in the house of Yahweh, beside the altar of incense. And Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and behold, he was leprous on his forehead. And they hurried him out of there, and he himself also hastened to get out, because Yahweh had smitten him. So King Uzziah was a leper to the day of his death, and he lived in a separate house, being a leper, for he was cut off from the house of Yahweh. And Jotham his son was king over the king's house, judging the people of the land.
Okay, thank you. With all those names in there, you see why I didn't want to read that. So what's the first thing we know about Uzziah? He was a young king, and he did what at first? Okay, and where did he learn that? Okay, from his father. So we have the parent setting a good example and teaching them. So he was doing this. It also said he set himself to seek God, instructed him and he also sought out Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of God. So in doing this, seeking God, he put God first in his life and said God helped him. Sounded like he was a mighty warrior and devised things, or had men that devised new things to defend the cities and things like that. And in verse 15 it says he was marvelously helped till he was strong. And then what happened once he became strong? He had all these great accomplishments, trusting in God. Then what happened? Yes, prideful. It went to his head, and so what did he start thinking? Right, I did all these great things, and you see that he was famous across the land, so he was getting this, big head from other people telling him that too. So I mean, I think that's the danger in that. This is very familiar of another story. What's another king who went in to not offer incense but sacrifice in the same way? Saul. I mean, very reminiscent of the same story of Saul thinking he had the authority, and Saul being impatient, thought he could take care of that, but it's kind of the same thing. And it's just amazing, all the things we read about him, what a wonderful king Uzziah was, and how quickly, once he became proud, that he became unfaithful. So I'll make this point now, because I don't even know if I wrote it down, but kind of, when I was reading it, another one came to me. So Uzziah was doing wrong. He was the king. Who corrected him in this manner? Okay, the priests, the Levites, I mean, they all stood up to him and said, you can't do this, this is not right. I mean, and you think about the power of the king, that's a pretty big step, but they did this. When we go to Uzzah, which we'll read that, but I think most of y'all know the story, was there any correction there? Was there any warning to the people? Okay, I mean, Levites should have warned them. Anybody should have stepped up and said, hey, this is not right. But the Levites didn't warn them in that. So, I mean, I think I really just made that connection there when I was doing this. I don't think I put that in my notes, but just to notice the two, that Levites didn't say anything to Uzzah, or David when they were moving the ark. So, correct, you're right. And yes. And somebody should have known. I mean, they were told. It wasn't, when we get into, we maybe, I'll put Uzzah as in the sin of ignorance. Don't think he knew he was, I know he didn't know he was going to die if he touched the ark, or that wouldn't have happened. Now, he should have known. Maybe he forgot. I don't know. I mean, there's things in that story that I'm not sure we have answers to, like why David didn't know, and then the things that happened after it, why David was afraid to move the ark. I'm like, it took them, I don't know, I think 3 months, if I remember, before they moved it and got instructions. So I don't know what all happened there. I'm not sure we know, but yeah, they weren't, and they were in rebellion. So you're right. So, yes.
And it doesn't say this here, but when he took over at 16, he probably listened to advisors.
Good point,
I
Roger.
think, here in his first part of the thing, he's king, but how do you do this? What do I do? He listens.
Right.
Well, what happened later?
Right.
Pride took over.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's a point. I mean, same with Josiah. When you make somebody a king at 8 or 16, they're not going to know that. But number one, he had example from his father, and then, his father was doing good, so his advisors probably were still there, and he sought them out. So that is a very good point. And then he sought out Zechariah, who instructed him, which we mentioned. God helped him against the enemies, and then he became strong, and the pride went to his destruction.
He did. Verse 17 says that they sent 80 priests.
Yes.
Not just one.
Right.
80. If I'm talking that.
That's a good point that I didn't even mention, is that it wasn't just one that went in there and said, hey, you don't need to be doing this. And yeah. So what lessons do we learn from this about pride and destruction? Let me ask you this. When do you guys pray the most? Everybody pray consistently, or you're unlike me? Am I just saying this? I mean, when do you pray the most?
When you're in trouble.
Okay, when you're in trouble. I think we see that in the Bible. I mean, David did that when he was waiting to see if, the child was going to live. We see Jesus praying. I mean, I don't know if he prayed any more than he did. He prayed more earnestly. We see Paul, wanting the thorn in the side to be removed. So I think that draws us closer to God, and it's a lot easier when things are going well to maybe not go to God like we should. I think that's human nature from the examples we see in the Bible. So when we talk about somebody being proud, and Uzzah was obviously, you could see it. I mean, he went against the Lord. Priests saw what he was doing. You can see this. The public can see this. But how can we be, maybe I don't know how to ask this, but the thoughts I had, maybe we'll get there. How can we be proud in a way that others may not see it in certain of our sins? And I'm probably just going to have to go to my point because I don't think I'm making that very well. I'll just ask this. What about our attendance? If we decide we know we're supposed to be here on the Lord's Day, take the Lord's Supper, we have an example, command. I don't think most Christians understand that is a command. But what about other services? Right.
Being here to hear more of the word, to be uplifted and strengthened by brethren, maybe that's something that we're above. We're not really in need of that, so we'll skip out.
Right. And, I'm telling you, in my younger years, it's guilty of this, of making excuses, saying, I don't feel like going. Not that I was sick, but I'm tired. There's other things. It's not a commandment. And you start reasoning yourself, and then you think about if you're having that conversation with God, what are you really saying? It's pride, and you're like, I've got other things I'd rather do, whether it's just sitting at home watching TV. I mean, you're putting yourself in front of God. And we can do that in many things, but I think attendance is one of those things, and we look at it. Hebrews 10:24-25, we're all familiar with it. It says, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more you see the day drawing near. That's our purpose here, is to teach, to encourage, and if you're not here, you're not getting that. And I think Bo made some very good points. I don't have your numbers, Bo, but about if you miss one service out of 3 in the week, how many that adds up in a year quickly, and how much you're missing out on. And again, that's just, it comes down to selfishness. We may not look at it that way, but if you don't do that, come to worship, and I'm not talking about unable to work, sickness and things, but if you choose not to, I mean, that's just a sense of pride, whether you look at it that way or not. Yes. Yes.
And that same David, when we talk about his son, he died at birth.
Right.
After his death. Text says he paid himself, he got dressed.
Yes. And sometimes, and I've been guilty of this, things go wrong in your life, you're like, I don't feel like going to church. I just want to sit in here and, self-pity, whether it's valid or not. I mean, you've got a child that dies, that's, understandable, but like you said, his example was, who can comfort me, who's going to help me other than the Lord? And I think that's a good point. And I mean, I'll go back to when you're younger, sometimes, or this is me, I'm not saying everybody, sometimes you don't feel like going. But you know what? You go. I mean, sometimes when you're in that, I mean, we shouldn't have that feeling, but you are, but you do, you just make yourself go, and then you start when, I don't know if everybody's been here, even now, sometimes I'm tired, I'm worn out, I'm not feeling that great, but I get here and I'm uplifted.
Once in a while too.
Well, I was about to make that example. When I do come here and I see people that I know are struggling, when I see Carl Reeves, and I mean, you can see the physical pain in his face when he's here almost, every service he possibly can be. And when I look at him, I'm like, I know he's uncomfortable. And there's others here. We have shut-ins, and when they can, they're here. And I don't know if y'all know that, but that's such an encouragement to me, and I think to others, when we see people in bad health and older people making that commitment, because it you very easily justify saying, I don't feel good, and I'm not going to go, but they're here, so.
The chances are you're going to continue, and it's going to get worse and worse.
In the habit of missing, yes. Or either way. I mean, yeah, you make yourself go, and then but you're right. It's a lot easier, because when we start missing, usually it's not, you just, Kimberly?
To recognize where that's coming from. It's not just us making a decision not to come. That's Satan
Absolutely.
in our lives trying to get us to make that first step away.
Right. It's not that big of a deal.
Which one is so we can deal with the second one and the third one, and then you can find it all.
Right. And when you're not attending and that happens, you're probably not studying your Bible and not making a blanket statement, and you're probably not praying as you should. Those things usually go hand in hand, and I can say that from experience when I was younger. I know that. So, I don't think you can be studying diligently and praying daily and then decide, I don't want to come to services. So I don't think those things go together. I had a few more points, but we're kind of moving faster than I thought, so I will skip on. Let's go to Uzziah. That is 2 Samuel 6, 1 through 11. 2 Samuel 6, 1 through 11. Mike, would you read verse 5 or 6, and then Richard, would you finish that up? 2 Samuel chapter 6. I think that's, yeah.
2 Samuel 6, verses 5.
1 through 5 is fine.
Again, David gathered all the choice men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called the Lord of Hosts, who dwells between the cherubs. So they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Uzziah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab,
there's a story of Uzzah and the ark. If we read just this account of this, do we know why Uzzah died? Not this just account, and this goes to, we need to, what's the word, Todd? We need to harmonize, and it's kind of a side lesson of this. If you read this, does God seem harsh, just this account? I mean, what was Uzzah trying to do? I mean, he was trying to keep it from falling. He was trying to, he understood somewhat the importance of the ark, not enough, obviously. But he was trying to do something good, and he was struck down. And, I think, especially people who don't believe in God, they may go to stories like this and say, what an unloving, harsh God just, struck a man down because he was trying to do something right in God's eyes. But we won't turn over there, but for reference, Exodus 25:14 and Numbers 4:15 gave instructions how to move the ark. They were supposed to move it with poles, and it was the Levites, and no one was supposed to touch the ark. And the penalty was death. So, when knowing that, the rest of the story, what would have happened if Uzzah didn't die? Okay, God's a liar. He wouldn't have been faithful. And then probably what would have happened if they knew this and Uzzah touched the ark and nothing happened. Okay, so that opens the floodgates, right? That's, the whole nature of God, of them dealing direct, especially in the Old Testament, how he dealt directly with them had an impact. You go back to things like the rebellion of Korah, and when the earth opened up and swallowed these people, I think that had a pretty big impact on them, at least for a little while. They understood who God was and things like that. So I think if he didn't, you would have just opened the floodgates to sin, made him a liar, and like I said, a whole lot of consequences of that. And just to mention a little bit, what was the Ark of the Covenant, or what did it represent?
The presence of God, it was a physical symbol of his presence, and actually sometimes it was visible, his presence.
Yes.
Either cloud or fire. It was very tangible, beautiful, totally.
Right.
That I guess you would say furniture, but something that God had prescribed to build.
Right. And it was, I think, like you said, the presence of God, it was holy. If I remember, I'm blank. I just went blank on who took the ark. And I think it was right there in the text that they were getting it back from. But where I'm thinking about is the God of Dagon. Didn't they have the Ark of the Covenant set up with their God? And their idol kept falling over. And then I think, if I remember right, plague broke out against them. And they were like, okay, I don't think we need this piece of furniture anymore. And they actually moved it by a cart to return it, and they weren't punished for that. They're obviously punished for these things, the plague and everything else. But I don't know if the two things have anything to do with each other, but how they moved it with a cart, I don't know if that came into play with David. We don't know. But that being said, what's wrong with moving it with a new cart? And we know the obvious answer, but why do you think they moved it with a cart? Absolutely. Especially if I'm one of the 4, 6, 8 men that are carrying it. Like, can't we just put that in a cart? That's how it got here. That might have been the story. That's how it got here. It'd be a whole lot easier to, do that. And thinking again that we can improve on God's plan. And there's a big danger of that on, this day and time, I guess always. It's always been the case when God gives a command and they think, well, we can do that better. We talk, Kevin's talking on Wednesday night on Bible Authority about things that have happened, and it really comes down to men thinking, we can do this better. There's a more efficient way, a better way than what God has given us. And again, that's pride. You may not see it that way, but that's what it comes down to. And just on the notes of what the Ark of the Covenant mentioned, different names of it was the Ark of the Testimony, the Ark of the Lord, the Ark of God, the Ark of God's Strength in 2 Chronicles, and then what were the three things placed in it? 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, and the manna, which, all represented, again, his holiness and him providing for them, and then the deliverance of the things, a reminder of who God was. So, I think that was the importance, and they should have known that. So, similarities here to Uzziah. What was Uzziah's reaction when the priest came in and told him, you can't do this? Okay, he didn't stop to think, oh, you're right, this is God's commandment. He just became angry, right? What was David's reaction here? Okay, in the wording in ESV says, mine says, David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzziah, and he was afraid of the Lord. I don't know if you read that into, but it seems like he was angry at God. The wording may not be that, but he was angry. God's the one that struck Uzzah down. And what does that tell us about pride and things? Does that happen to us when we sin and consequences come? Is the first thing we do look at ourselves and say, okay, maybe I didn't do something right? Or is it usually to blame either someone, or sometimes it's to blame God? Why did you let this happen? And when you're going against God, I know those questions come up when you are serving God. We don't always have the answers to why things happen in our lives, but in the case of sin and things happen, it seems like we become angry, and I think, again, that's part of Satan's plan, is for us not to focus on ourselves. And then, again, I don't know if anybody has any thoughts why no one either knew how to move the ark at this time, or no one stepped up and said anything. I don't know if we have any. I didn't go too deep down that, but
When they did that, they had to do something right.
I didn't think about that, Andrew, but if they touched it, I guess they should have died. So maybe they did have poles and just, I didn't even think about that they had it, were carrying it right, and set it on the cart. And good point. I don't know, but Toby?
I think it could be because they didn't have a covenant relationship with God.
Okay. So there wasn't any.
They didn't have consequences because there was no covenant there for them.
I think he was talking about the Israelites putting it on the cart. Somehow they lifted it, and it seems like if they would have touched it, they would have died. Would have been the logical thing, but I don't know. But it's again, we read in the Old Testament how if we don't teach one generation, what happens to the next one? How quickly we fall away if we're not taught. So it may just been a time of, I don't know. I struggle with David not knowing. Or maybe, again, we're forgetful, and he was focused on getting the ark back and other things. We see, Tony?
We don't know, but maybe David thought it was more expedient.
Yeah.
And then the reason a lot of times people won't speak out, first of all, he was the king. He says we're going to move it that way, that's the way we're going to do it.
Right.
And even today, when we talk about the Lord's word, unless we have strong Christians, when things are taught, it may not be exactly according to the word of God. It may be some variation. Some people won't speak out.
Right. That's a good point. And him being king, you kind of go back even to his sin with Bathsheba. When Nathan came to him, that was a big step because, he was the king. And King Uzziah, on the other side of that story, they took the men in there to oppose him and say, this is not right. So you just see, maybe where they're at, just kind of opposite. Yes?
Samuel 7:2 The ark was at Abinadab's house for 20 years.
Okay.
And 20 years, Israel didn't go back and retrieve the ark until David.
So there wasn't,
So they didn't even think about going back and trying to retrieve it. So there could have been a new generation that came along and completely forgot how to move it.
yeah, that's a good point. 20 years, they're probably not going over instructions on how to move the ark because they don't have it. And again, I think they moved it with a cart, so that seems like the easiest way. It's just, let's get focus on getting, I guess the end results is getting the ark back and not focusing on how. Eli?
Of David's anger too, that, it's been here forgotten for 20 years,
Right.
and I go try to get it and make this right, and you kill somebody
Right.
because of it. But there's a lot of things that we do where good intentions don't mean it's right. We can get
Right.
really zealous for a lot of things, and I'm sure David and all these people were thinking, we're going to get the ark back, this is great, they're really zealous, good intentions about it, but when you don't compare your intentions and your plans to what God has outlined to do, it doesn't matter how much zeal or good intention you have, he's still not going to be happy.
Right. Details matter to God. I mean, we read this in the story and a lot, and a lot of people today don't think they do. I was going to make this point in Uzzah lesson, but Betsy had a friend at work that was talking about she started going to one of these community churches, and she was telling her about it. He said, I just love it so much because it allows me to worship God the way I want to. Didn't say anything, didn't think anything about making that statement, but how arrogant is that?
A different direction I've been mulling over last week, because it's interesting to me what happens and what David says. Yeah, almost this. I almost feel like it's this sense of regret. And I found a reference in the margin of my Bible that references Peter. He's reflecting the Lord falls on his face and said, "Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man." So in my mind, part of me kind of feels like whenever David's anger burned against the Lord, and he became fearful of it, in the next verse, and it says, he said, David was praying, Lord, how can the ark of the Lord come in? I kind of feel the same mentality that Peter shares whenever he's this anger burned out against him, but I also understand the implication of this ark and how sacred it is. Maybe I feel unworthy now to have that opportunity in my people. How can the ark of the Lord come to somebody? Even though I understand God's commandment, what we're supposed to do with this burned out anger against him. So now we have problems forward.
Right.
And that kind of goes along with how David in his relationship with the Lord. It's so important to him to be right with the Lord, like to be right, that connection with him. He falls off. And he goes through great pains. Psalms 2 describes what it's like when he's in tune with the Lord and whenever he's not. So it's just kind of a different direction.
Yeah.
Just kind of based on some of the stuff that he says and what happens with the ark.
I think that's very good points because we know David was always seeking God. I mean, he made a lot of mistakes, we learn, which, is discouraging when we read the story, but it's encouraging to us to know that, David did these things and always made it right with God. And so I appreciate that, Garrett, because I think you may be right that the unworthiness of that and then waiting in 3 months and then we don't have time, but I thought it was 3 months and then apparently they did. I'm assuming they sought out how to carry the ark and got the instructions and did that, and then they brought it back to them.
This whole section here, but one thing I think about is like parent-child relationship. Is the consistency God shows throughout all this and making known His ways and following through. It's a good thing for parents.
Yes.
Being consistent and always following through. Because if you don't do that, then your children are not going to come back to you like God's children will come back to you.
Very good point, because if you say something, this is the consequences, and then when it comes around, you're like, well, that's not the consequences. Kids pick up on that very quickly. Same way, when we talk about teaching, is we need to get our children to Bible study. We need to get them in all services, but that's not enough. Just because we get them here, if we're not living Christian life at home, they're seeing a different example, that's going to be a bigger impact than getting them here. Jacob?
To that, kind of go along with that point, it's unfortunate for Uzzah, but imagine how many of the 30,000 now have a greater respect and honor for God that they may not have previously to him. So that's
Right.
something else that you just it set an example for that, and you see that throughout the scriptures and our society as well. Is that once one person sees the example, then the rest of the people will say, "Oh, that's serious."
Right. At least for a little while, like everything else. We don't have much time. I think we've covered everything. And I was just going to go over the conclusion, how we prevent sin from ending our lives and taking over our lives. First thing we need to know is God's will, and the only way we can do that is by studying. If they would have known the instructions of God, these things wouldn't have happened. We need to pray daily. I think we know that. But we need to remember who we're praying to. Over in Hebrews 2:17 and 18, I won't read the verses, but just the end, he is able to help those who are being tempted. We need to remember Christ was on this earth. He went through everything we could possibly go through and probably more. And he is our mediator. So when we're praying to him, it's, sometimes we pray thinking, maybe not with faith, thinking I'm not going to get an answer, or I don't think we come out and say it, but maybe God doesn't understand what I'm going through. But he does. Christ went through everything that. We need to assemble with the saints, as it's Hebrews. That's the purpose of building us up and edifying. It's to worship God, but it's also for our benefit. We need to rely on other Christians for help. I think Carrie's here. I talked to Carrie Frizzell. Most of us know that his daughter, they're going through a hard time, have for years looking for answers. And he just told me, he said, I don't know what people do if they don't have God and a Christian family to support them. And I just think, I don't know. You can have physical family that can help you, but when you're going through things like this and you're not getting answers immediately, I don't know how people deal with that without faith in God and a Christian family to support them. So we need to remember that too. And then I think we need to put away things. We need to examine our lives and put away things that are leading us away, that we know are leading us away. Either it's friends or relationships that are drawing us away from God. We need to put those things away and start associating with Christians, not just here, but, outside of services. So that's all I had. Anybody else have any points or comments? I appreciate your helping me get through this.
I'm not getting these lessons. They're not
Yes.
getting them. As a matter of fact, I think they avoid it.
That was another point, Alan, I appreciate that I had in my lesson is teaching of that. When the churches are that, there's a lot. We can be teaching truth, but if we don't teach the whole truth, it's still going to lead to, error. So thank you.